NART, which is the national organization of which RISC is a piece of, and I was at their annual clergy gathering. And I hope all your ears were ringing, because I got to brag on you so much it was ridiculous. I got to brag on you because a lot of the other churches that were there, when they talk about justice ministries, think that they're really stretching it, really stretching their whole faith to be able to think of doing RISC or PACE or peace or whatever version is in their city. You see, RISC has a model. It works on things that are injustices that we see really locally. So if you remember the beginning of the fall, we had a house meeting where people shared what kept them awake at night. That's the question that helps us decide what to work on. We ask everybody in all 25 churches involved, 22 churches involved, 22 congregations. What keeps you up at night? And then we take that information and we compile and try to come up with 5 or 6 categories. And then at that first assembly, remember when I asked you to go to that assembly this fall? We then decide on 1 or 2 issues that we will work on, depending on what we have capacity to do. So this year, if you remember, when we had that meeting, the decision was that the 2 things that seem to be most important at this moment for us to work on was housing, to continue to work on housing, and that's a continuation from last year. And the other one was what to do about gun violence. Now, we're not talking about gun laws here. We're talking about what you can do in Richmond on gun violence. So now we have been in a research period. We have been in a research period to try to figure out how we can be effective in the area of gun violence here in Richmond. And we're looking at models that are being used around the country. We're looking at ideas, and then what happens is we will take what we think is an appropriate idea and have discussion with city leaders. We're going to want them to do it. We are not a group that does the work. We are a group that looks for answers and pushes those who are in city positions to do things. So we will be taking it, and that's why we invite you to come to the 2 spring meetings. One is so you know what's going on, what we're going to be suggesting, if you haven't been part of the research team until then. And then the Nehemiah Action, we bring in people who can affect the change and ask them to do it. And we don't bring them in unprepared. They will have been spoken to numerous times. They will know. We will have a fairly good idea whether they plan on saying yes or no before that meeting happens, or whether we're going to have to continue to work on them. But the Nehemiah Action, to be effective, you have to have a large group of people there. So a lot of what we do is get people excited to be able to be the people speaking. So that's a fairly simple way of doing justice. That is we always have just a small bite there, right? A small pieces that we think we can do, such as when we were talking to the school system and we were asking them to try a project, to try a trial project to see if this reading program would work here in Richmond. Like, that's the kind of thing we do with RISC, okay? We ask for people to try it, okay? We know that you have to have a chance to try it to see if it's the right answer for Richmond. We don't say, you're gonna go gung-ho on this because we say so. We say, we want money for a pilot project to see if it's the right answer. We think we see from other cities that are like us that it might be. Well, you do a pilot. So when we were talking to the school system, we were asking them to do a pilot. We're following through on that now, and we're asking them to make that pilot bigger and bigger as it is being successful. But that's really a very small piece of justice. But in this church, we also work with Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy at a state level. This week, that has meant that there has been work on making sure that people who are minimum wage earners get 1 hour of sick time for every 30 hours they work, which basically ends up meaning that at the end of the year, they'll have 4 days of sick time. I don't know about you, but when I go to a restaurant, I would prefer if the people who are sick stay home, not make my food, right? But if they don't have sick time, that's not an option, because they gotta pay their rent, or else they're gonna be in Caritas. That's justice work at a state level. Because we are part, and we have been part, and we have worked with and celebrated with Equality Virginia, this week we got to celebrate the fact that people who are gay, lesbian, transgendered, questioning, and anywhere else on that wonderful spectrum can't lose their housing because of it. Can't lose their jobs because of it. That bill has gone through this week to keep people safe. Because we work with the Poor People's Campaign, a number of us have been working this period of time. We're getting ready for June 20th. June 20th, there is going to be a huge rally in DC. You know what's different about this rally? Whereas most of the time these rallies are made of the likely folk. You know who I mean. Those of us who know how to get on a bus or a train and go up to DC, because we have the money, we have the ability, we have the option of going and speaking for ourselves. For June 20th, we're working for those who are disenfranchised to be able to go and speak for themselves. People who are homeless, people who are living on a very tight income, who couldn't possibly put aside $50 to go up on Amtrak for a Saturday, plus food, plus, you know what it costs to go up to DC for a day. That's not feasible, even from Richmond, for many people. And the Poor People's Campaign is working on people from all over the country being able to come and speak for themselves. And we here at St. John's work on all these pieces all over the place. We answer that call that was in our first reading. We don't think that spirituality is just about me. We understand that our faith calls us to action. That our faith calls us to take care of our brothers and sisters. And yes, even though our president doesn't like it, it calls us to love people we don't like right now. Our faith, when practiced well, calls us to work for justice. And in the midst of both of these readings, we're being told that that is the worship that God requires. So now, folks, I'm going to challenge you a bit. We're coming into this season at the end of the month that's called Lent. How many of you most years for Lent give up something, like chocolate, sugar, or alcohol? You know, those things we give up easily, right? But this reading says to us that that's not the fast God's looking for. God is asking us to fast from injustice. God's fast that God wants from us is to think of some way to help create more justice. Now that's a challenge because that's not the way we usually think of Lent. We usually think of Lent as very personal, right? It's about me and mine. But both of these readings challenge us to be a light of justice. To be a light shining on a hill, showing what faith can be. So I invite you to think a little wider as you plan for Lent. You know, we all know that in truth, every decision we make affects other people around us. Our passions for ordering on Amazon affects the environment. Where those things come from affect other countries when they are able to have slave labor. And sometimes we want cheap goods versus paying attention to what that means in a supply chain. We want cheap goods rather than thinking about what our local store does for their workers. So I challenge you as you think about what you will give up this Lent, to think in terms of both environmental justice and economic justice, and how your choices of fasting can support a more just world, as we are called to do from Isaiah in each one of the servant songs. as we are called to do from the Gospel of Matthew over and over and over. Amen.
If you will turn to the back of